If we could all sit down again, we're about to start our fourth panel on politics and governance. It should be very interesting. My name's Johanna. I'm a member of the Stanford team, and I'm here to introduce you to this panel's moderator, Zach Levine. So Zach is a fellow from the 2014 AMENDS Summit, and he is the president of a virtual exchange organization called Dorm Room Diplomacy. This organization, through video conference dialogue, has connected students from more than 40 universities in 15 countries throughout the West and the Middle East to broaden perspectives. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Zach. Let's welcome him.
Hello, everyone. I am very excited and humbled to be moderating this panel today. We have a great cast of panelists, so let me get right to it and introduce them. Our first panelist today is Samir Khan from Oman. Samir is a PhD student currently in mechanical engineering in India. He received his master's from the University of Pittsburgh, and in 2009 founded an organization called Keynovations, which sprouted up from a self-charging battery startup. And he also is a consultant for the UNDP, the UNEP, as well as the founder of ASIC, which is another NGO. So let's welcome Samir. Secondly, Amir Ben Ameur. He is a 20-year-old Tunisian activist. He's the founder of WeYouth, which focuses on youth participation in decision-making in Tunisian society. So I'd like to bring up Amir. Thanks so much. Thirdly, Mohamed Belarbi. He is the founder of the Arab Institute for Youth Policymaking. He is from Rabat, Morocco, and his initiative, the Arab Institute for Youth Policymaking, focuses on bringing students, policymakers, and diplomats together in order to improve awareness as well as capacity in lobbying for youth issues. So let's bring up Mohamed. And last but certainly not least, we have Hanan Abdul Hadi. She is a Palestinian national, grew up in the UAE, and is currently working for the for POMED, which is the Project on Middle East Democracy in Washington, D.C. So before I let the panelists go ahead and discuss themselves a little bit, I just want to let everyone know within the general topic of today's discussion, which is policy and governance, our panel has decided to focus in a little bit more specific on turning advocacy into law, particularly in regard to civil society engagement in the policymaking process. So they're going to all talk about their experiences in civil society in their respective countries, or in Hanan's case, her work with the country she specializes in. So first, I'd like to invite Samir to share a few words about some of the work that he's done and how he made it here to coach.
Myself, Samir Khan, an engineer by education, but I've worked in the fields of sustainable development, education, human rights, policymaking around my past 8 years. With respect to what we are doing right now at CHRDS, that's an organization at which I'm the Director of Operations, Center for Human Rights and Development Studies. We are providing a platform for individuals, organizations, and countries towards revolutionizing the policy-making mechanism by involving youth voice. So youth voice integration is the process towards actually achieving a proper policy. When we talk about governance, everyone has a problem with respect to democracy. They're like, our voice is not involved towards the final policy, which is being decided by a government. So we are bringing and bridging these gaps together towards an actual policy-making mechanism. And we have succeeded it to a large extent with respect to support from UN. We are currently in the advisory board for the UNDP for civil societies and various other organizations as well. But today, the main thing which I'll be emphasizing on is Oman, a country where there is no democracy, but still in the policy-making mechanism, youth voice is integrated. So that's what I'll be putting an emphasis on.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope Hope you're doing well. It's a tiring day, it seems like. Okay, I'm Amir Ben Ameur. I'm from a country called Tunisia, the sparkle of the Arab Spring. The what we call, like, we make a lot of troubles in Middle East, so I know. So Tunisia, when a young street vendor called Mohammed al-Bouazizi set fire to himself, and that what created a tense within the interior places in Tunisia that led to Ben Ali escaping to Saudi Arabia and the revolution taking place in Tunisia, and now it spread somehow to many other countries. So we basically, I have established a youth organization legally and formally launched in Tunisia in 2013. We basically work on involving and integrating the youth participation in decision-making, leadership education, and we want to ensure the highest extent of youth participation in governance, accountability, transparency, raising awareness, political participation. We basically want to strengthening the youth participation in socio-cultural, economic, and political uplifting. We had several initiatives so far, like we had some project on the elections. We wanted to mobilize the community and raising the awareness about the importance of the first democratic, transparent, fair elections. And in a way now, we want to create kind of accountability platform in a way that when we vote for someone, he should be accountable. And you know that all the things that we are discussing in previous and hopefully in the other panels are correlated to governance and public policy. Governance and public policy is the framework of all the things, entrepreneurship, economic, I don't know, stability, human rights. Governance and public policy are the key concepts of all these things. So we will be more in depth about the framework, not only the initiative, hopefully, and I leave the floor to my fellow.
Hi everyone, I'm Mohammed from Morocco. I want to, before I start like my spiel, I want to correct a misinformation that we've been kind of reiterating throughout this conference. We've been talking about the Arab Spring, about like Arabs toppling governments, about revolutions taking place, started by Tunisia, the troublemakers, and spreading across the Arab world. But in fact, revolutions are happening every day. They're happening in the Arab world, they're happening in the US, in Europe. The only difference is that while in the Arab world we take it to the streets, we face tanks, we face riot police, people are leading revolutions under the parliament. People are leading revolutions at the steps of Congress. People are introducing laws and legislations in order to change things. So revolutions are happening everywhere. The means are different. And that's where the Arab Institute for Youth Policymaking comes into play. We're trying to incorporate a culture of youth lobbying, of youth trying to put their ideas forward, not through throwing Molotov cocktails or through throwing rocks and facing police, but through introducing legislation and trying to put streamlining their ideas into policy proposals that politicians or different Arab organisms can act upon. What we do is we bring together young people in different countries in the Arab world with policy experts, law professors, and diplomats, and facilitate workshops so that these young people can put their ideas to the forefront. So you demand equality, you demand justice, you demand gender uplifting for women. But how do you want to do that? And that's where we help them. We try to show them that policy is a complex process. You can't just demand justice and expect tomorrow that a president or governments are going to change a constitution or are going to change a penal code. You have to do it through gaming the system. So we're trying to streamline these ideas and trying to use the young people as a powerful force for change through means that are democratic, institutional, and also far more efficient. Because at the end of the day, the young people who led the revolution in the Arab world, you don't know their names, but you know who's the president of the United States, you know who's the president of Egypt at the moment, you know who's the minister. So these people are the ones who are legislating. So how do we bring these young people to be commemorated or remembered as people who have introduced policy, who have introduced legislations, not only as faceless demonstrators who have done their job of toppling a government and letting another corrupt government take place again. Thank you.
All right, as Zach mentioned, I work for the Project on Middle East Democracy in Washington, D.C. For those of you who don't know the Project on Middle East Democracy, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit, independent organization, an advocacy-oriented think tank, if you will, concerned with examining how genuine democracies can develop in the Middle East and North Africa, with the belief that all people have the right to govern themselves in free, democratic, and inclusive societies that respect civil liberties and protect human rights. My work specifically at the Project on Middle East Democracy is within the Civil Society Partnerships Department. We work with organizations in countries of transition, primarily Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen, and recently we've expanded our work a little bit to include Iraq. What we do with civil society organizations, especially advocacy-oriented think tanks that sort of want to have a similar role to what POMED does in Washington, is we help them to build capacity in the areas of advocacy and policy writing to ensure that they can be an effective bridge between engaged citizens and the governments that make policies on their behalf. So we work with them to develop their skills, and to produce publications that will be read and consumed by policymakers, and then develop advocacy strategies to make those policy changes happen.
So the first question I have for all of you is to just get a little bit of background on your respective countries. And I want to ask you about the policymaking processes in Oman, in Tunisia, in Morocco, as well as if you want to discuss Yemen, that would be fantastic. And particularly focusing on the role of civil society organizations within policymaking, and try to keep your answers quite brief so we can move on to the meat and potatoes of the next few questions.
As I had closed my opening remark with, we do not have a democratic model in the country, but still we have a policymaking mechanism which involves the integration of people's voice. Now, how does that happen? It's through the Shura Council. It's a council where it's like the lower level of the parliament, which are elected through elections. Like there's a proper election happening over there. Individuals from their respective communities stand up for the election. Now, how does this thing work with respect to policy making? So the final decision maker of any policy in the country is His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said, who is the ruler of the country. So if there's a grievance or a problem or an amendment required in a policy with respect to any of the fields of the country, so individuals can inform to the Shura Council in their community with respect to what is required. Now the Shura Council will proceed forward with the proposal, if required, to the higher level of the parliaments. And this goes to the ministers and then finally to the ruler of the country. So there are different hierarchy levels maintained over here with respect to how a policy can be amended and how a policy can be developed. So in a simple way, we do not require political parties over here, and it has been working really functionally since past 42 years and plus, and people are in a very happy situation. There's a harmony with respect to how the country is going. So that is a paradigm shift of how we perceive democracy in our country.
Talking about Tunisia is a very complicated case, actually, because in the post-revolution period, there is a huge dynamic and very fast changing is taking place now in Tunisia, especially in terms of governance, public policy, and as you may know, that in the post-revolution period, like 3 governments were succeeded in Tunisia, and now we are having another government. So the unstable political scene in Tunisia had made kind of there is no long-term strategy in terms of public policy implemented by the government. So, but during the last elections, when we elected the new parliament and new president and new government was emerged from them, we are somehow working toward establishing a national-wide public policy and governance strategy. However, the things that we have been talking and discussing with politicians and with decision makers in Tunisia was only rhetoric. But the good thing that if you are advocating for something, or you are somehow lobbying to the government, and you are advocating for a specific public policy and and some laws, the good thing that the Tunisian government and the authorities are responding, because they got elected in a transparent and fair elections. Because if I am electing you, and if you don't make keep the promises that you have made, you will lose the next elections, and this is the case for some political parties in Tunisia during the first elections. So here comes the role of civil society in Tunisia and the international institutions. And by the way, they are doing great, the international community and civil society organizations. However, the new culture of civic engagement through public policy and governance is not like very spread, because we didn't have, like, even now we don't have a lot of think tanks institutes in Tunisia, and like in Washington D.C. or in other many places. So there are also few associations or NGOs working in that field. That's why we need more mobilizing and raising the awareness about the importance of public policy and governance, especially that many Tunisians think that we already held the parliamentary and presidential elections and that's it. But we have more important elections, the local institution elections. We are having in 2016 municipal elections that will make kind of changing the life of the citizen, because it's more close to him. So that's why now we have somehow to increase our advocacy and to make higher contributions toward public policy and governance, because
Thank you, Amir. I need to cut you off.
Yeah, thank you.
So we get through the rest here.
Okay.
Well, you heard the set of challenges that the two colleagues here mentioned. Now imagine both of them combined. Let me explain. Morocco shares with Tunisia the fact that we share with Tunisia the fact that we were both colonized by France. So our laws pre-independence and post-independence are very much influenced by Paris. The second thing we share with Tunisia is that we are, at the end of the day, a Muslim majority country. So a lot of our laws are also influenced by Sharia law. Now, the third complicating component is that something we share with Oman, we have a king, or in their case, a sultan. So the king can introduce laws just by royal decree. So here you have three major forces that kind of are trying to shape the different legislations and different penal codes in Morocco. And at points, it's really hard to find which channel to best follow if you want to actually enact a certain change. We were lucky, at least after the new king took oath in 1999, because he was a reformist. We saw that the civil society had a far greater say in what kind of laws were introduced, what kind of laws were adopted. In fact, most of the laws today are suggested and put to the table by the civil society. We have the Mudawana, which is the legislation taking care of the family, especially women and different various aspects of the nucleus of the community and society. And these legislations are suggested or at least advocated for by different women NGOs and also civil NGOs. In fact, they managed to get a petition with 1 million signatures to push the government to strike down an amendment that was in one of our laws. We also had seen great leaps forward by women organizations in Morocco that have managed to revolutionize women legislation. I'll give you an example. Back in Morocco, just a couple of years ago, a guy could rape a girl, and in order to avoid jail, he could just marry her. That was it, the end of the story. Now imagine how cruel this is. Thanks to a couple of women-led NGOs, this has been changed because there was a wide petition. There was a huge pressure from civil society to get the government and also the king, by implication, to take an active stance. So these couple of years, we have a very strong civil society involvement in the policymaking process, and this is just getting stronger and stronger by the day.
Great.
Because
thank you. Yeah, move on.
I'll be very brief. My experience is, of course, secondhand because I don't actually operate in the countries in which our partners do, but my experience is secondhand from them. Suffice it to say that regardless of all the differences, civil society plays the same important role of, like I said previously, bridging the gap between engaged citizenry and their governments and policymakers. In Yemen in particular, maybe unlike other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, there is actually a relatively long history of this kind of work, and Yemeni civil society has numerous examples of successful implementation of advocacy strategies through the use of coalition building, often using religious institutions or tribal networks to build a kind of grassroots support for the policy changes that they would like to see and delivering them through those appropriate channels to government to impact change.
Thank you, guys. In addition, Anan, I know that you focus, in addition to Yemen, also on Libya and Egypt. And so since we had the Tunisian perspective, the Moroccan perspective, do you mind just doing a quick compare and contrast to the civil society landscape in Egypt and Libya to what you heard from your colleagues?
Egypt, also like Yemen, has an older history of civil society. Unfortunately, that's been a little bit more restrained due to the political landscape in Egypt and the various threats to democracy and freedom of expression there. It does make the environment a lot more challenging for civil society. That said, civil society is very vibrant and they do everything they can in terms of monitoring government and relaying that information to to the public. On the question of whether or not they've had a lot of success in terms of using advocacy to affect policy change, I can't especially say, but from my experience, that's been relatively limited compared to other parts of, or at least compared to Yemen, for example. In Libya, civil society is very young. It didn't really exist before the revolution. It's definitely one of the most energetic civil society scenes I've ever come across. And that's kind of what keeps our faith and our hope going for Libya, because despite all the challenges and threats that they face, they are very, very vibrant and very enthusiastic, and it always brings me hope when I go and see them. So.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd like to open it up to questions. Do you have a microphone?
Is it working?
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, Zach, and the panelists. Thank you so much for your inspiring work and your initiatives. And I would like to have the chance to thank the coach team for bringing, making this possible, and everyone who actually contributed to this. I have a question for the panelists, and my question might be a little bit loaded. From your experience, how threatened or insecure the policymakers or the government you're working with are, and how you deal with that? How do you take it from there? So any one of you feel free to answer. And if you have any specific examples, I would like you to share it with the audience. Thank you.
Anyone want to take it?
Well, let's talk about a scenario of our country where civil society organizations are not allowed, where NGOs are not allowed to be established. So how does things work out over there? So we have Tawasul, which is an organization established by the government, which is a not-profit. So that is one way. Now, okay, there's one organization, but what about the other entities, other regions? One organization cannot reach everywhere. So there's a workaround in that. That is student body and student councils in respective universities. So now, in this scenario, what happens is a student council can come up with projects with respect to whatever problem they have, and then proceed forward towards policy and various issues which they want to create an awareness upon. Now, with respect to a scenario where it was really difficult or it was really huge to target the audience, it was a project by the United Nations which we were working on. It was on the World We Want 2015 forum, where we had to capitalize all the private sector industries together, and the youth as well, and the government, and what was their perspective on environmental sustainability and how we can make changes on the policy. And that was okay, we have so many industries. They have their governance policy with respect to recruitment, with respect to CSR, with respect to environment, with respect to everything related to governance. Then there are youth who have their vision towards these companies and how they perceive their community. And then we have the government itself with respect to how they perceive these companies and the youth and employment. So we created this common platform online with the support from UN on the World 2015 Forum, and it was a common gathering of everyone together, and we could discuss on a common platform. And that was like marginalizing the gaps between all these things together. So we overcame a lot of issues with respect to this.
Excellent. We have a lot of questions, so we'll let you tackle the next one. Rachel? And then afterwards. Squeeze you in.
You touched on this a bit, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the leverage that international NGOs or international players play in either uplifting grassroots civil society initiatives or influencing policy, or perhaps the opposite, the negative effects that come with that. So maybe looking really briefly at some of the positive things that either the UN or other multilateral agencies bring to the table, but also potentially some of the repercussions of that.
Actually, I would love to respond to your question. Can I? So, concerning about the international community work in many countries, especially that the Arab Spring countries, like in Tunisia, after Ben Ali left or escaped to Saudi Arabia, about a week, like many international organizations rent some offices and they get headquartered in Tunis. So the international community, especially in the transition period, they are very, very interested in the transition period because it's very interesting, you know. But however, in the post-transition period, maybe even the donors, even the international organization will leave the country soon. This is what I am anticipating. That's why talking about the threats from the government, in a way to ensure sustainability, you have to ensure capacity building of civil society organizations through making networking, through advocating, and especially through ensuring that these civil society organizations are strong enough to stand for their for gender issues, for accountability, and to ensure that all the community, like governments, authorities, NGOs, international NGOs, all focusing on implementing a good strategy for public policy and for governance in a way to ensure democracy.
And how are they doing in Tunisia? How are they doing in Tunisia?
Actually, in Tunisia, there are many projects, like International Republican Institute now is having a project on political accountability, and this is very interesting. Like, they want to ensure, especially that there is somehow an international pressure. Like, if you are dealing with political parties, it would be better to have an international partner to have some kind of credibility in a way. But in the future, as I said, through capacity building, through networking, through lobbying and advocacy, we will have like more impact and higher contributions. Thanks.
My question is for Hanan regarding the Egyptian case, of course. Currently, I'm curious about the practicality of what can happen in Egypt, especially that I think we are in a phase that related to spirit burning, like activists are in jail, media is being controlled, and we do not have a policy mechanism to lobby it because we do not have any parliament. We have even a new capital that's being constructed without any citizen being included in the decision. So I need to know what kind of capacity building people can like go for it to handle this kind of complicated situation, because people end up just discharging whatever they have as an initiative in social media, which is, let's say, not really helping. So I need to know about what kind of practicality in capacity buildings that can help in this kind of situation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about the way you characterize the context in Egypt. And you're absolutely right that practicality is a big question, and it's one that we struggle with in terms of our work with civil society in Egypt as well. But I think it's important for us to continue to, all of us in Egypt as well as the international community, to continue to lay the foundations for this kind of inclusive, free, democratic society that we would all like to see in Egypt. And I think one way of doing that is in building the capacity among civil society organizations, one piece at a time. And so we start with the basic bricks of how to write persuasive policy briefs, for example, how to phrase your arguments in such a way that it makes it more appealing to a policymaker should you be able to deliver it to someone who can actually make that change, how to map out stakeholders and people who can influence change in a way that is appropriate for the context that you're in. You're right, there isn't a parliament currently in Egypt, but there are other mechanisms that people can use, informal mechanisms that we've seen people use in the Middle East and North Africa, even before the revolutions. And so getting people to think about ways that they can deliver those policy recommendations and those changes that they would like to see in the way that is appropriate for their context is one way we can do that. At the same time, we continue to build and develop the advocacy skill set that people have, and we continue to think about in the future, when the future is brighter, how do we actually play this out in a freer setting? And so in building those capacities now, we lay the groundwork for a future Egypt that is very different than the one we see today. And in doing it with one civil society organization at a time, I think they begin to play a role in educating the wider public and developing this kind of more mature rhetoric so that people aren't just saying everything they think on television without necessarily having evidence-based thinking behind it.
We'll take one last question. I believe Jessica had her hand up last time. For Mohammed, we could have him fight for the question.
Mohammed, you talked a lot about channeling youth energies from, you said throwing rocks, or what it sounded like was violent resistance, and channeling that energy into advocacy work, which in a way sounds a little bit like silencing dissent. So my first question is, do you see no worth in violent resistance towards the state in Morocco or elsewhere? And my second question is, can you really have democracy with a king? Just to get at the root of the problems.
She gave you some softballs there.
Well, to jump quite quick to your second question, I don't believe there's democracy with a king. So this is like my clear stance. And one should not be able to decree royal legislation just because of his bloodline or because he's been appointed to a certain position. So I'm clear on that. The second question, the first comment, I mean, it's understandable that like sometimes forced rebellion or armed struggle is necessary in some cases, especially in cases where you don't have institutions, where the only way to channel your opinions or to establish your positions is by throwing rocks. I mean, like the case of Palestine is a clear example of that. The case in Morocco is somewhat different because we already have institutions that, although not functioning very well, can still be a vehicle through which you can like pass legislation or at least expose your ideas to policy makers and stakeholders. Maybe they're not going to act upon it, but at least it's creating a culture of lobbying and active engagement in policymaking. In the United States, it's very apparent. Like on campuses, in DC, you can feel that young people are involved. They call their senators, like reach out to the office of their congressmen, and they're trying to petition for their own ideas to be discussed at least. In Morocco, we're trying to do the same. Maybe like this is not something, projects for a year, maybe a decade, or maybe a century, but at least this journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step, I guess.
I'd like to give a big round of applause for our panelists. I believe we have a much needed coffee and cookie break right